Good day to you, and I hate to hit you right in the face with this question, but who is reaching into your pocket all day long without your explicit permission? Who's taking money from you? Who's taking money from you by virtue of the media you are either intending to consume or not intending to consume? As is the case with getting on Facebook or Instagram or all those other big data collection companies that are using everything you type to sell. They're selling it and they're not paying you for it. But there are other ways that media are making money off of you as well, and that is the subject of our class today. We're taking on Chapter 3, the media business, and there is no doubt that in the United States, media are more of a business than perhaps any other country in the world, with the exception maybe of Japan. Not that I know every other single country in terms of its media business. I know a lot of them because I teach a course called Comparative Media, including, right after this course finishes, I'm teaching it in Sweden. But to get back to the United States, this is a media business country. And the chapter starts out with Mark Zuckerberg. It talks about Facebook. It was basically a messaging system in a dentist's office. That's what Facebook started out as, an instant messaging system so that the patients didn't have to be retrieved by personnel. They could just be called on an intercom system. And now look at it, right? Mark Zuckerberg, I think he's the youngest billionaire ever at the age of 23. That's when he became a billionaire. So media are reaching into your pockets each and every day. We're going to explain that in today's class. We're going to talk about various media conglomerates. These are huge media companies that are spanning across the world. I mentioned one of them last class, the News Corporation. And there are many others. We're going to be covering them in today's class, not in as much detail as the chapter. I really want you to dig into this material in the chapter and see truly how expansive these media conglomerates are, how many subsidiaries they have. Subsidiaries they have, smaller companies, smaller divisions. I want you to see how many properties they have across the world, and you can only get that by reading a book. We're going to talk about the book. That's going to be one of our early mass media inventions that we get to. All right, so let's go first, though, to talking about the tradition of private ownership in the United States and talk about why there is so much media business as opposed to public service, as opposed to government-owned media, as opposed to military-owned media. There are other options, right? So why do we have this tradition of private ownership in the United States? Well, we have it for many reasons. Our country is generally skeptical towards government. We see that every time we elect people for office. The people who are anti-government are often the ones who are getting the highest public opinions. But there are other reasons as well, and that's because media started out as private enterprises, eventually using advertising. Let's start with the 1638 printing of the Cambridge Press. You can follow along the links that I provided you in the email, by the way, with this stuff today. It's the first for-profit newspaper, and it published the whole book of Psalms. That was the newspaper, and Psalms is spelled Psalms. It's a religious text that you could sing to, you could talk about. That was a for-profit newspaper from the get-go, meaning it was selling, right? It wasn't offered as a public service. And in fact, this is what we refer to as the colonial period in the United States. The 1638, we weren't a country, right? We just had settlers coming over from Europe. Doesn't mean that they don't have media. They're establishing media just like you have in Europe. And although we haven't talked about the newspaper yet, newspapers were around. Similarly, another publication in colonial America was Public Occurrences. Public Occurrences, note the spelling on that. It's Old English, Publick. Both domestic and foreign. The key point about this is it was like coffee house subject matter. It was like looking on your phone at social media today. Gave people something to talk about. Now let's mention a name we're going to be highlighting the next few days. You know him probably very well from American history, Ben Franklin, but we're going to be talking about him in different contexts in this class. Ben Franklin actually became wealthy as a media mogul, mostly because of the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was a newspaper that was the most important newspaper in New England, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Ben Franklin started that, and by the way, he was rather ruthless. As as Postmaster General, he had a government position, Postmaster General. He blocked other newspapers from being distributed by the U.S. Postal Service. only his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, could be delivered by the Postal Service. And that's an early example of monopolization or control of the market in a ruthless business endeavor. He also, by the way, hired the best editors, the best readers to come over to his paper. He actually was one of the early media, what we call moguls, somebody who was successful in other media. We'll mention those later on in the class as well. Early newspapers were very expensive, by the way, just like the first iPhones, out of the reach of people. And you find prices come down. They're very expensive, and not everybody's reading them. Not everybody could read. People were largely illiterate and weren't able to read English. And you have also other foreign language people as well, French people, for example. So we have a very different situation at that time with who could actually access media. You have to be educated to access at least this form of media. By the way, just to contrast with other countries, you can take a look at the United Kingdom, or Britain, as you might consider it. And some people say England, though that's only one country. In Britain, you have the BBC World Service, the British Broadcasting Corporation World Service, and that is a service that is provided for by a license fee. If you don't know what a license fee is, it's where when you buy a television set, you are obligated to pay a government fee called a license fee, and the money's raised from that. It's about $400 a year. The money's raised from that then go to pay for programming on the BBC. And therefore, the BBC doesn't need to use advertisements, which change the whole complexion of the way that media content is structured when you have advertisements in there. We'll also be talking about that later in the class. So just want to let you know there is another option other than completely business-oriented media. Let's talk now about the growth of national news, because that's a big factor in the United States coming together as a culture. Because the people living in Pennsylvania had to find something in common living with people in Georgia. And I tell you, if you go to the two states, there's a lot of differences between the people in those two states. So how do you start to feel that you're an American first rather than a Georgian or a Pennsylvanian? Well, magazines were the first to bring about national culture by talking about national issues, like talking about farming during the winter. Very hard subject, right? And that would appeal to somebody living in any state, Virginia or in New Hampshire. So that is how magazines started to bring Americans together. And TV followed up with that. You have broadcast television, eventually the nightly network news that started in the 1960s, and that started to bring people together. Eventually, by the way, the government did establish a national media system that is a public service system. It's called the Public Broadcasting System. It was established in 1968, and that's where you get PBS, Sesame Street, and all those shows that our parents have PBS sort of babysitters for, and Masterpiece Theater and Nova and all these other mostly educational oriented programming. You also have NPR, which is National Public Radio. We have a repeater on the campus of East Stroudsburg University. A repeater takes the signal from WVIA, which is in Scranton, and then repeats it here at East Stroudsburg University. It's public service, so we do have public service media in the U.S., but they are infinitesimally small compared to public service media in Britain or France or lots of other countries where when you go through the remote control on your TV, the first 3 channels are public service and offering really good and interesting content as well, in my opinion. All right, so now let's go on to the big media conglomerates. We're going to talk about how these companies have so many properties and they are reaching into your pockets every single day. The biggest one is Disney that we're going to start with. It's not the biggest, I should say. It's the world's most famous company brand-wise. It's kind of like McDonald's overall. The M is the most famous icon across the world. Coke's up there too. Disney is just famous across the world. It is a legacy media company. It's one of the first companies. It primarily is focused on producing content, not necessarily delivery. Content is what Disney does, and it also expanded once it got past the beginnings of cartoons drawn by Walt Disney and then feature films. Then it went into theme parks, and everybody knows it's like a pilgrimage in the United States, right? We go to Disney in Florida more than we go to Canada, which is actually closer to us in Pennsylvania. It's like a pilgrimage in the United States. That's how embedded it is in our culture. Disney's very different across the world. In France, you can get wine at Disney parks, and Disney's in Hong Kong, China, and elsewhere as well. Disney has several subsidiaries, several sub-properties, among them ESPN. Did you know that ESPN is owned by Disney? Did you know that ABC is owned by Disney? ABC. Did you know that Pixar is owned by Disney? Yeah, Disney owns Marvel Entertainment. There's a lot of stuff. Disney is a partial owner of Hulu. Disney owns as a partial owner of iTunes. Um, Pretty incredible, that Disney company. Now let's go on to, and I know people that are just absolutely fanatical about Disney. I got to say, they just absolutely, they live for Disney. They absolutely use it as a model for values and a place to go to repeatedly. And the extent to which Disney is in our culture from an early age is just, to me, just amazing. Next up is that company that I mentioned last time, that global media conglomerate, I should say, the News Corporation. Yeah, that's the name of it, the News Corporation. Recently, it broke into two parts. It's got the News Corporation, which is one subdivision, and another subdivision is where you live, a division, the News Corporation, and then it's got 20th Century Fox, which I know that you recognize. Under the News Corp division, we've got the Wall Street Journal, we've got book publishing, we've got some information services, financial information services, whereas under 21st Century Fox, you've got cable, broadcast, film, pay TV, and satellite. So when you watch Fox, that's coming through the 20th Century Fox. If you watch FX, same thing. This company was the brainchild of Rupert Murdoch. He was an Australian originally. He went all over the world with his media empire, lots of Australian newspapers, got into Britain, had his eyes on the US, and he decided that he wanted to come to this market, so he took up citizenship here. It took him 10 years. Then he started to buy a bunch of TV stations, and he put them together into the Fox network. That was launched in 1996. Fox today is a dominant player in cable television, satellite TV as well. And around the world. It's got the Sky TV network in Britain. It's got the Sky B network. It's got Sky Italia in Italy. It's got Star, which is throughout Asia. This company also, by the way, owns the National Geographic and the Wall Street Journal, one of the premium newspapers in the United States. We'll talk about that when we talk about newspapers. Next up is the Warner Media Company, which is now the AT&T company. This company has had a lot of ups and downs. It used to be the biggest media company in the world, but it started to fall about in 2010, mostly because they decided to merge with another company, AOL, which is just a shell of its former self now. That merger proved to be disastrous because it had two different cultures of employees. The Warner people were much stiffer, wearing suits, old white men, so to speak, and the people with AOL were still old white men, not old white men, young white men, and but they were more of a younger, almost quasi-hippier generation, dressing informally on the job, having different ideas about how people should work in groups. So that company didn't work that well. But it does have a tremendous legacy of properties that it's owned. For example, it owns Fortune. It started and continues to own Fortune magazine and Life magazine. Those are two really big magazines. They were founded many years ago in 1922 for Time magazine. Time magazine has a Time Person of the Year, still a very important event in U.S. culture. This company, Warner, also purchased CNN. It's a CNN company, purchased CNN from the owner Ted Turner. Ted Turner started that company. We'll talk more about him later when we get to television. But this also includes a whole plethora, do you know that term? A whole plethora of other media properties. When you get Ted Turner's company, you get WTBS, you get TNT, you get Turner Classic Movies, you get the Cartoon Network. Yeah, you get a lot of stuff. You get WTBS, TNT, those are big ones. They're coming out of Atlanta, Georgia, believe it or not. In 2014, Time Warner made Time its own independent company, and now it's reorganized as the Warner Company. You've also got, by the way, a bunch of magazines other than just those two that I mentioned, Time and Life. You've got 90 magazines and websites that are magazine websites. All right, speaking of strains, let's go to the next company. This one is many incestual ways to refer to this relationship. You've got Viacom on one hand, which is Viacom, that's how it's spelled. Big properties in New York City. You'll see the name if you go to Times Square. And you've got CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Okay, so CBS was the first company. It started as a cigar company on radio, yeah. William Paley had a cigar business, the Columbia Company selling cigars, and he wanted to advertise them, so he bought a radio network, or he established a radio network, just to advertise cigars. Columbia Broadcasting System has soon found out it could do other things like news and entertainment. So you've got that company, and then when film became popular, it decided to establish a division to make film called the Viacom division, and then later on, Viacom became so popular, it started to accumulate more wealth than CBS, and get what happened. Viacom bought CBS. They say the parent bought the child. Strange, huh? That's why I say incestual. Over the years, though, this relationship has gone back and forth. They've separated, but kept the same board of directors. Now they're back together. It's really tough for me to follow where they're at. It's like a marriage that keeps, expanding and contracting with each other. It's still a very dominant force. It's got the MTV property, the VH1 properties. You know those very well. This company also is at the center of the indecency debate in the United States. That's when Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake exposed her breast during a Super Bowl halftime show. And that launched a whole series of fines that were levied for obscenity, and then rejection of those fines and court cases, et cetera, et cetera. CBS still known for that. Now let's go to a company you probably don't know, the Bertelsmann Company. Bertelsmann from Germany. It's actually the world's largest publisher and the world's largest publisher of English language books. It's not just German. And music sheets, music score sheets, sheets that musicians play from, notes. Bertelsmann gave his Pop Idol. Interesting story here. That show started out as a Bertelsmann television show, aired on a Bertelsmann television station in London, Channel 5. And the show originally there was called Pop Idol. Pop Idol. Well, Fox found out about it. Fox says, we need to bring that over here. We're going to rebrand it as American Idol, right? Because we have a lot of nationalism to us when it comes to identifying with performances. I'll say more about that when we get deeper into the class. They renamed it American Idol, and that it comes from the Bertelsmann Company. Very popular show, still on today. Also, the Bertelsmann Company owns the RTL radio and TV network. That's standing for Radio Television Luxembourg. Luxembourg is like the tiniest country in the world. It's like this. I've stood in Luxembourg. You can see the borders of Luxembourg as you look around. That's how small it is, right outside Belgium and France. That company, that name, though, is all over Europe. The RTL radio and TV stations are in almost every country in Western Europe. Amazing. And also, Bertelsmann has multiple television production companies. So it's a big player, more so in Europe than it is here. Now we're going to go to not legacy companies, now to newer companies. First one up is a local company, if you want to think of it that way, Comcast. You know about Comcast, right? It owns NBC, another radio network, the National Broadcasting Corporation. You know NBC from television. It's still the brand that's used, but it's a Comcast property. It owns most of the stock in that. Comcast started as a cable station. It was originally founded in the Midwest, but then was headquartered in Philadelphia. And Comcast also diversified into sports teams, right? You got the Philadelphia Sixers, for example, and Comcast owns the stadium, Wachovia Stadium. And so Comcast is kind of presented a new model, becoming a media conglomerate. NBC has its own history, its own storied history. It itself was formed from two radio networks. It had the Blue Network, it had the Red Radio Network, and it became so powerful during wartime that the U.S. Congress split it up. It said, you got to sell one of these radio networks so that you're not dominating political opinion and advertising. And one of those radio networks became the ABC radio network, American Broadcasting System. So NBC has some interesting history there. Also under the auspices of this company, you've got Telemundo, Bravo, USA Channel, the Weather Channel. Yeah, there's a lot of cable television channels there. Also, this company sells cable TV access just in general. You want to watch TV, you want to watch the Phillies, you got to have Comcast. Internet service. Phone service, again, presenting new models, burglar secure alarm system services. Really incredible how this company has diversified its holdings. All right, you might be wondering why we haven't talked about this next company, but we're going to talk about it now. It's the Alphabet Google company. The Alphabet Google company, this is, in fact, the largest company in the world media property-wise. We've got to call it that way, even though really it's an advertising agency. That's all Google is, and for that matter, Facebook. The parent company is Alphabet. Did you know that? Alphabet is the parent company of Google, and it's a search engine, presumably, but it's an advertising agency, and then it brings together all the media that we're studying in this class, TV, radio, into your laptop and into your television. Also part of this huge, monstrous company, you've got YouTube, you've got the Android operating system, you've got Google Maps, Google Docs. You've got some more hidden companies from the public eye, like Calico, which is an anti-aging research company. You've got Project Wings, which is about drones for delivery. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, this company started by Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Basically, this company's main revenue driver is AdWords. It's a software processing package that used where advertisers bid on the rights to advertise next to search results. So every time somebody types in their results of primary election, for example, or types in there how to fish for bass or whatever, the links that come up that are advertising links, they have been bid on, and the highest bidders get those top spots. And that's how Google's making its money. Next up is Apple. Apple, right? Apple, another company. 90% of you in this class probably have an Apple phone in your pocket right now, or in front of you on the table. My students typically 90% and above have Apple. That's how much it's cornered the market. Pretty amazing, right? The Apple company, it's started by Steve Jobs. It's got the iPhone. It started out with the iPad. It started out with the MacBook, and it's got the Apple Watch. Yeah, tremendous company. It actually had two people who founded the company. Steve Jobs is the one who is known for because he was a visionary, but also he founded it with Steve Wozniak. And it had a kind of a up and down relationship with Mr. Jobs there. He was forced out in 1985, and they didn't like the way that he was running the company, so he was forced out by his own board of directors. How would you like that? Start your own company and then you're kicked out. He went and founded the company Next, N-E-X-T, which was a Unix-based computer. Unix-based being the software code, the computer code. That's about as deep as I can get with it. And then that became the code that was used across the World Wide Web. So Apple says we made a mistake, and it bought Next and brought back Jobs as president. And then Jobs went on with his visionary stuff, right? The iPod, iTunes. He also went and purchased Pixar from George Lucas, making those Star Wars films. And then he turned into the leading animation studio and sold it to Disney. So Steve Jobs was quite the entrepreneur. Now that we've spoken about the main media companies, and there are others, when you look at radio, for example, you have just companies in radio. We're going to talk now about a business model that all of them are shooting for. It's an either-or situation. It's called the short head and the long tail. I'd like you to take a look at the link for this. So basically what this refers to is there's two ways to make money in the media business. One is in the short head range. That's where everybody would like to be. That's the sweet spot. So we have high capacity, high volume selling products, right? So anything that Drake releases, anything that Taylor Swift releases, any Marvel film that comes out, that's going to be high sales right now because there's high demand. They're very, very popular artists, okay? But then there's also this long tail. That's where you have fewer sales and longer inventory. And that's when you start to see shows appearing on Netflix that were originally on television, like Breaking Bad, for example. That's in the long tail right now. There's no new episodes Breaking Bad. It's in the long tail. And that's how companies try to make their money. You want to be where the short head is. So that, therefore, is going to wrap up our discussion of the media business. And again, I ask you to answer this question throughout the day. Who is reaching into your pocket from the media world?